It's one of the most cynical moves I've ever seen in this very cynical space that is the Middle East. Just a few days ago, Israel decided that it would finally start moving toward recognizing the Armenian Genocide, and its foreign minister and other officials said that they were moving in on a cabinet decision to present this recognition of the Armenian Genocide to the Knesset in Israel and formally recognize this Armenian Genocide. There's just a few problems with this, and in a few minutes I'm just going to get into this really cynical move. The Armenian Genocide is serious business. What happened in what is now Turkey in the years of the Armenian Genocide was a horror show and a nightmare, and it actually was the event historically that led to the term genocide being created later on. But we will get into that just a little bit on this rather short episode of Badlands. That's the name of my podcast. I'm Borzu Deragahi, and you can find me on Substack at borzu.substack.com, as well as on YouTube at the Badlands Podcast. You can just search for it and just hit like, or I'm on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts as well. So I hope you try to find me there. It would be great if you would follow me in one of those circumstances in case you're just listening to this somewhere randomly. So with regard to this matter of the Israeli recognition of the Armenian Genocide, what's truly ironic and kind of cruel is that the Armenians for decades have been trying to get the United States and other countries to recognize the Armenian Genocide, commemorate it, call it a genocide. And that's basically what it was. But because of the decent relationship they had with Turkey, Israel would use its lobbying powers to prevent it from being recognized in the United States. Eventually, it was recognized in the United States. And I think that's very good that it was. This was something that happened in 1915, 16, 17. It was a horrific tragedy and a disaster that befell the Armenian minority inside what was then the Ottoman Empire in its final years during World War I. And it was a genocide in that there was documents, plenty of documents that showed how the emerging leaders of what would later become the Turkish Republic, but what was then the Ottoman Empire, were plotting this, and they plotted it for various reasons. There's lots of documentation, and there's this really great scholar that I'm going to try to interview sometime later this year, or maybe even sooner, who used his access as a Turk to go into these archives and found just devastating and just basically incredible records documenting the Armenian Genocide, why it happened, the economic incentives that the so-called young Turks felt that they were deserved, and so on. But I think that this was so cynical on the part of Israel to recognize this genocide now, even though it's been sitting there on the table potentially for them to recognize for many years, many decades even, because now they're in a spat with Turkey. And the reason they're in a spat with Turkey, there's multiple reasons they're in a spat with Turkey. It comes down in part to Gaza, Recep Tayyip Erdogan being upset about what's happening in Gaza, about the Israeli treatment of Palestinians in the West Bank as well. This is a very popular cause in Turkey, the Palestinian cause, and Erdogan is in part trying to ride that wave, but I think his conscience is a little bit moved by what's happening to the Palestinian people. His Islamist base and hardcore supporters are really in support of the Palestinian people. But it's also just, you hear it from the Israeli right and center and all over, not just from Netanyahu, from the opposition and so on. They're saying that Turkey is next, that after they defeat Iran, which they haven't been able to do, that they're going after Turkey. And they are really upset that the U.S. is talking about giving these jet engines to Turkey, or selling these jet engines to Turkey that Turkey needs to develop its own fighter jets. Israel does not want Turkey to develop its own fighter jets, and it does not want it to become more advanced militarily because of this idea that some in the Israeli establishment have that they're going to somehow take on Turkey and weaken Turkey, and it's the next on their chopping block on their path to regional supremacy. Even with the U.S. support, they couldn't overtake Iran. I live in Istanbul. I live in Turkey, and I think it's a fantasy, just given the military capability that Turkey has, the track record of winning wars that Turkey has, including in Libya and in northern Syria and in Azerbaijan as well. And that's another one that I'll get to, the Azerbaijan conflict. So I think it's a fantasy that they have, that they're going to somehow take on Turkey. And so in that case, they have to block Turkey from developing good relations with the U.S. and developing good relations with other countries around the world and strengthen its ties to NATO partners that Israel sees as its potential partners. And, you know, but I think it's so absurd that they would think that this is even a possibility, given the fact that Turkey has 90 million troops, this incredibly robust military industry that's already proving crucial to conflicts such as Ukraine. And the Europeans are getting, if anything, closer to Turkey. And Erdogan and Trump are more and more cozy and buddy-buddy. So I don't understand what the thinking is and why it is. I also understand that Benjamin Netanyahu is really pissed off at Erdogan because he convinced Trump not to allow this cockamamie scheme to activate the Iranian Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan to go against the Iranian regime. And that's one of the reasons why they say that the war, we didn't finish the job. We could have done it if Erdogan hadn't intervened, if Qatar hadn't intervened, if only like those American mamby-pamby liberals hadn't put the brakes on Trump, et cetera, et cetera. And so Netanyahu's kind of upset at Turkey for the perception that it prevented Trump from going all out on Israel's scheme to overthrow the Iranian regime, which is also a fiction. If you get a chance to look through past episodes of this podcast, we go over numerous times why this was just a plan, the plan to use the Iranian Kurds to topple the regime. What a joke it was. And anyway, the logic is bad, but there is this friction, and so they're trying to do this. But in the process of doing this, in this very stupid way of basically announcing that they're going to recognize the Armenian Genocide, and you have Gideon Sar, the foreign minister, going out there and saying, we're going to do it, better late than never, he said. I think there's a bunch of other issues that came about that really complicated this. First of all is the issue of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan fought a war against Armenia in 2020 to take over this disputed territory. They call it Nagorno-Karabakh. The Armenians call it Artsakh. This area between the two countries, the complications of why this area is disputed, how it goes back to the time of the Soviets and Stalin, and how the Soviets tried to pit Armenia and Azerbaijan against each other by, putting Armenians in Azerbaijani land and vice versa, and so on. So it goes way back then. But anyway, this war in which Azerbaijan defeated Armenia and took back the territory that the UN recognizes as Azerbaijan, it couldn't have been won without Israeli weapons. So on the one hand, Israel is recognizing the Armenian genocide that happened more than 100 years ago, 110 years ago almost, while betraying the Armenians that are now in the region. This caused a backlash from Azerbaijan, which was like, hey, this is really not appropriate to be condemning Turkey, our main partner in the region, to create this situation right now. And why right now? Because this exact moment that Israel did this is when Armenia and Azerbaijan and Turkey are on the verge of this incredible breakthrough. Like one of the true success stories of the recent era, where the prime minister of the leader of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, is this somewhat of a pragmatist, and some would even say maybe a little bit of a visionary, who says, look, we're surrounded by Turkic-speaking people in Iran, in Azerbaijan, and in Turkey, of course. We can't live this life of Armenians and this fantasy and LARP like we're these Armenians in Glendale, California, or Watertown, Massachusetts, two communities I kind of know where there's a lot of Armenian exiles who are very Armenian nationalists and so on. We can't pretend that we're like that we just need to go to Congress and get a few resolutions passed and that'll fix it. We live in this neighborhood and we have to make peace with these people. And so this Nikol Pashinyan, as well as the leaders of Azerbaijan, Aliyev, and Erdogan, are on the verge of making this huge opening of the region, of the Caucasus, of the South Caucasus, and opening up trade. And Armenia, the real Armenia, not the Armenia from 110 years ago, is about to have these great relations with Turkey. There's no real bitterness anymore. There's no tension between Armenians, actual Armenians, including those who are like just a few miles from me here in Istanbul. Many of them are quite assimilated in the culture. They speak Turkish. They go to their Armenian churches and so on. There's still Armenians here. They travel to Yerevan or other parts of Armenia and come back. They do business. They do cultural events and so on. So there's really, like right now, this is more than anything, this recognition by this interloping state, Israel, that is trying to obviously distract attention from its own alleged genocide in Gaza and its ethnic cleansing and harassment of Palestinians in the West Bank. Obviously, this like naked, opportunistic attempt at distraction is just so like it's so nakedly stupid and ugly and nasty, and it's just so idiotic. And what's interesting is Nikol Pashinyan was asked about this recognition, and he was like, "Yeah, I don't really comment on people who try to instrumentalize the Armenian genocide. I don't really comment." The reporter asked him again, and he was like, "Yeah, not going to say anything to that." Like people were trying to make political use of the Armenian genocide many years ago. Mr. Prime Minister, outside of the session, a question. Can I ask a question about more specific, the position of the government regarding Israel's decision to recognize the genocide? For Armenia, that decision, is it welcome? We do not see a need for a response because we believe that not entering into the topic of the weaponization of the Armenian genocide is the interests of the Armenian Republic. We do not see a need for a response, even in the future. And there's another interesting aspect of it is like even Erdogan kind of brushed it off. The Turks kind of brushed it off. And this is the part that I think is really super interesting. Like I've lived in Istanbul for many years, and I have been coming here for even more. I've been traveling here for more and more. And when you're a reporter and you come to a country like Turkey, you get into conversations with people. You get into conversations about sensitive stuff. Even if you're just here as a tourist, your journalistic instinct, you'll talk about these kinds of issues. And I've noticed over the last 20 years just how much more open the Turkish people are about this Armenian issue and what happened in those events. It used to be sort of verboten if you use that word, genocide. And then it became sort of like, well, I don't know, we'd call it a genocide, but like really, yeah, terrible things happened, awful things happened to Armenians, and it's really bad and it's really ugly. And so there's this kind of opening up of this issue, and this, in addition to this peace flowering between Turkey and the real Armenia, the one that is just on the other side of the country's eastern border, in addition to that, there is this intellectual space that has opened up and has become really free thinking to some extent. You're not going to get like arrested. You're not going to get in trouble if you talk about the Armenian issue here and if you talk about what happened way back then. And I think that, you know, it was really, really, as I said at the beginning of this podcast, it was very horrifying what happened during the Armenian genocide. And it was actually the definition of what a genocide is, this extermination of people and attempt to use various tools, including, you know, gunfire and shooting and mass killings, as well as the death walk of Armenians to exterminate the population, destroy the community. And there are so many different aspects of it. This is something I've read about, and it was really horrible what happened. But it also, like technically, when it happened, there was no such thing as Turkey yet. Turkey was not founded until 1923. It was still like a different regime. It was a different system. There was a vastly different system still at that point. Okay, yes, the people who were behind the genocide, and this might get me in trouble, were Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's ideological and political fellow travelers. That is absolutely true. But it wasn't Ataturk himself, as far as we understand and know. And he wasn't like ordering people around to do this. So there is a sort of disconnect between what happened at the end of the Ottoman Empire, the centuries-long rulers of, you know, what was before Constantinople, and this part and parts of Mesopotamia and the Anatolia and parts of the Balkans and so on. And then there is this new republic founded in 1923 from the destroyed ashes of the Ottoman Empire that Ataturk forged. So there is this sort of historical discontinuity. And there's another complicating factor as well to like basically pinning this naked Israeli attempt to pin the genocide on Turkey today. And that is there was no such concept as genocide until like the 30s and 40s. And there was no idea that this was a thing. There was no term. You can't charge a person with a crime before that crime has been written in the law. So I think there is that complicating factor as well. And then there's another really important thing, and that this is not to justify it, but it's just to provide some context. You can't really understand the Armenian Genocide without understanding what happened in the Balkans, in the Balkan Wars that preceded World War I, in the early years of the 20th century, the two Balkan Wars, and the mass expulsion of Muslims from Bulgaria and other parts of what was then parts of the Ottoman Empire and Serbia, and there was mass expulsions there, and there was mass killings there as well. No one talks about those events, but those people who were expelled from the Balkans during the Balkan Wars. There was the first Balkan War and the second Balkan War. There was these mass expulsions, mass ethnic cleansing of Muslims, Turkic peoples from those parts of the Balkans that were under Ottoman control as these independence movements rose up. And these people came to the Ottoman Empire, what was then the Ottoman Empire, the last years of the Ottoman Empire, and they didn't have anywhere to call home. They had nowhere to sleep. They had no jobs, etc. They were living like, refugees essentially. And, one of the reasons, one of the incentives, and not to justify it, but just to give like an understanding of what was happening there, and just to complicate the picture a little bit, and to show why Turks are a little bit reluctant to just say like, oh yes, one day we woke up and we decided we're going to slaughter all the Armenians. It was because of those mass expulsions that this happened. Because if you look at the documents, and if you read the documents and you read about the rationale behind the Armenian Genocide, one of the reasons was we need to come up with some wealth and some homes from these people who were displaced. So we're going to basically call these Armenians collaborators with the Greeks and the British against whom the Ottomans were fighting against, and we're going to give their properties and give their wealth of these Armenians to these refugee Turks that have washed up on our shores because they didn't know what to do with them. Again, that's not to justify it, but I'm just explaining like why this is such a sensitive subject in Turkey, why it's such a complex subject, and why it's such a big subject, and why Turks are somewhat reluctant to go with the genocide thing, even though they're more and more open to describing what happened to the Armenians as a genocide. And indeed, many of the Turkish people I know, even there's like examples of people I know who 15 years ago, if you brought this issue up, they would get like all like stiff and argumentative, and now they're like, yeah, what happened then was a horrible thing. It was a genocide. It was a genocide. So this culture has evolved, and Israel's attempt at meddling, it's this stupid, idiotic attempt at meddling in this sensitive issue at this sensitive moment is just like kind of unexcusable. Anyway, there was other news over the last few days, even non-Iran related. There was recent decisions in the U.S. Supreme Court that I was asked to speak about during an interview with the NewsX World. There was a whole bunch of decisions, and what people want to know around the world is what do these decisions by the Supreme Court, what they mean for Trump and what they mean for America's political trajectory. Have a listen or watch on what I said.
The U.S. Supreme Court issued two major rulings yesterday, fundamentally altering the balance of power between the White House and federal regulatory agencies. In a 6-3 decision, the court overturned the 1935 Humphreys executor precedent. This ruling grants the president broad authority to remove heads of independent agencies, such as the Federal Trade Commission, at will, removing the long-standing requirement to prove neglect of duty or malfeasance. However, the court drew a strict line regarding the Federal Reserve. In a 5-4 ruling, justices blocked the president's attempt to remove Governor Lisa Cook, affirming that the central bank's unique statutory protections remain fully intact to ensure the independence of U.S. monetary policy. Legal analysts describe this as a major expansion of executive control over federal oversight, while creating a definitive legal divide between standard regulatory commissions and the nation's central bank. Now joining us live to tell us more is Borzu Daragahi, journalist and founder of the Badlands newsletter, joining us live from Istanbul. Mr. Daragahi, thank you so much for joining us once again here on NewsX World. With regards to Trump and this story and this latest development, as far as broad authority is concerned, we also know that essentially now Trump has more authority over some other agencies. This is essentially a sign that when it comes down to power, it can be given back and forth. What more can you tell us about this broad authority and whether or not you believe that this is the right move for Trump and, of course, what he's involved with. Tell us more.
Well, there's this years-long trend of the Supreme Court giving more and more power and authority to the presidency and to the executive branch of the U.S. government, especially when there is a Republican in power. Many of these Supreme Court justices were appointed by Trump himself during his first term. And it's really a measure of the increasing corruption and lack of integrity on the part of this particular Supreme Court. They do stand up to Donald Trump usually. And it's interesting, those cases where they usually do stand up to him, it's almost always for standard old school Republican kind of pro neoliberal capitalism cases. Like, for example, maintaining the integrity of the Federal Reserve to some extent, meanwhile allowing Trump to appoint his lackeys and I don't know how else to describe them, bootlickers to various commissions that the ruling elite and the oligarchs that the Supreme Court justices really serve consider unimportant.
Right. Mr. Dargahi, do you believe that Trump will continue to retaliate in any way, shape, or form, just based on his past and the fact that when it comes down to Trump, he essentially views himself as the ultimate victor? What more can you tell us?
Well, interestingly, he does seem to respect the Supreme Court rulings, even though he doesn't respect, for example, Congress or any other courts. When there is a brick wall in terms of the Supreme Court, he does seem to stop. I think the bigger problem is going to come when there is a backlash from the Democratic side. As viewers may know, the Democrats are really gathering steam, especially the left wing of the Democratic Party. And if they come into power at any point, as they have been coming into power in primaries and other elections, there's going to be, like, there were already calls for blood during the Biden administration, including a proposal to expand the Supreme Court to include more liberal or left-leaning members of the Supreme Court, changing the composition of the Supreme Court. And I think that that is really more where the retaliation will come. And perhaps that might be why Donald Trump is treading carefully, because he knows that it'll be even worse if there is a more liberal Supreme Court, if the number of justices is expanded, for example, to 13 or even more, and the court is packed with his enemies.
Mr. Dargahi, are you aware of any rule within the United States that can remove President Donald Trump? Of course, we know that he's asked for more money with regards to Iran, and of course, moving forward, his behavior might not align fully with what the Supreme Court or other authorities in the United States require as well. What more can you tell us about his complete authority and whether or not any sort of authority in the United States can evict him?
Well, I'm not a legal scholar, but I do know, just from being an American and having watched these cases several times over the course of my life, that there are two ways, officially at least, to remove a U.S. president. One is through the impeachment process, and that basically involves a majority vote of the House of Representatives, the lower house of Congress, and then that goes to the Senate, where there's something like a trial for the president with people speaking on behalf of him and against him. The Supreme Court acting as the judge in that particular trial. And in that particular case, you need a 2/3 majority of the senators to vote to impeach him. And this has happened never in the course of U.S. history, because when it was about to happen to Richard Nixon in 1973, he resigned before that vote could take place. The other way is through, I think it's the 25th Amendment, when enough of his cabinet members themselves deem him unfit for office and vote to remove him. Those are the two ways that Donald Trump could be checked and removed from office.
And of course, with regards to Iran and what's happening with Iran, there are some back and forth sort of discussions there. It's relatively aligned with President Donald Trump. Which side are you, well, not favoring, but essentially looking towards to find some sort of truth from? Which side can be trusted more, Mr. Dargahi?
You mean in terms of Iran and the United States?
Yes.
Well, I wouldn't trust either of them. But I will note that the United States, which is supposedly the banner bearer of freedom and justice and liberty and truth truth worldwide and has this reputation, no one trusts their word anymore. And there's a common joke that whenever the White House says something, all the journalists rush to see what the Revolutionary Guard are saying on their website, because no one believes him anymore. No one believes the Iranians either. They exaggerate, they make stuff up, they are full of bluster as well. But for the Americans to be in that situation where really their word means nothing, their signature on documents means nothing, that's a very unique situation right now.
Let's go back to what we're seeing as far as the Supreme Court and, of course, President Donald Trump. Essentially, when it comes down to President Trump and his broad authority, I've asked you more about whether or not he can be taken out of office and, of course, how he's essentially adhering to the Supreme Court. Do you believe that there are other authorities that Trump would like to go against? I've also asked you about whether or not he would retaliate with regards to this. Who do you believe Trump would like to go against? Are there any authorities or any other cases that you know of or have any insight of that could potentially sabotage his midterm elections or, of course, his popularity in the United States?
Well, I don't know about, I mean, his popularity is one issue, but who would he like to go after? I mean, everybody from like the head of the Kennedy Center, the Opera House and Performing Arts Center in Washington, D.C., to the local governments, to companies that defy him. He seems to think to governments that defy him abroad. He seems to think that his authority expands everywhere. And the Supreme Court, however, does seem to be the one place where he does run into brick walls and whose decisions he respects. But he is basically trying to run steamroller over Congress. He doesn't care what the critics say. He wants to control the media. He wants to control what, city elections, what happens in city elections. And he has an opinion on those. And he considers certain members of the House of Representatives that are elected basically illegitimate, should be deported. So I think that he has a lot of a very expansive view of his own power and purview. But when it comes to the Supreme Court, that's the one institution he seems to respect. Hey, thanks so much for listening to this rather shortened edition of the Badlands podcast. Again, I am Borzu Deragahi. You can find me on YouTube or on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts, but especially on Substack at Borzu, BORZOU.substack.com.